I'm just gonna say right now, you might hear some birds in the background of this video. There is a little nest of baby birds that just hatched underneath my porch, which is right underneath where I record. If you hear the little peeping of little baby birds, I'm sorry. They're noisy. In the words of Owl City, every mushroom cloud has a silver lining. Oh my gosh. What is this opening? Okay, so every cloud has a silver lining may be a cliche, but it can be true even if sometimes you have to squint. You can find good in a lot of bad things. For example, every time a particular famous British wizard author goes off on Twitter about trans people, there is one thing I find that always lifts my spirits. The discussion threads both on Twitter and off of people talking about middle grade and young adult novels that feature diverse and especially LGBTQ+ characters. If you haven't had the pleasure of seeing these threads, they usually go something like this. Hey, adult who is buying books for their niece or nephew or kid or whatever, instead of Harry Potter, you should try buying them Percy Jackson / Magnus Chase / Cemetery Boys / The Young Wizard series / Amari / whatever else. And the comments or replies are just people chiming in with how lovely and wonderful Rick Riordan is, how he created an imprint just for authors of different backgrounds to share their stories, or how Diane Duane has a series of wizard books that have continued to evolve with the times, actually writing some of her queer characters into the books rather than declaring them to be queer outside of the text, like some folks. People suggest new authors I've never heard of, new series that are coming out all the time, all featuring Black and Latin and Asian and gay and trans and even asexual characters. And I just love this. It is delightful every time. I mean, it's happening in response to something that is just so hateful and awful, and the fact that something really great is coming out of it, I don't know, it just makes me happy. Plus, I love middle grade and young adult books. I mean, that's not all I read. I read plenty of adult fantasy, mystery, horror, whatever. Personally, I'm not super picky, but in making that clarification, I do want to say that that's not to say there's anything wrong with people who read a lot of YA. This is not a safe space to make fun of people who read whatever books appeal to them. If that is only young adult fantasy, then read what makes you happy. And frankly, I do get why some people spend all of their time in that age bracket. It's a good time. There's a kind of a potency of power that a lot of other novels, especially like adult fantasy, just does not carry. There's an immediacy to the drama, a sense that whatever is happening right now is the most important thing that will ever happen, a feeling that our characters can really make a difference and change the world. I don't know, I think it just feels good to read. I also really love reading middle grade and YA because I love exploring how these books are trying to talk to kids. The best of this genre introduces new ideas, pushes the boundaries of kids' minds by exploring concepts that they might never have considered otherwise. This is especially true of fantasy and sci-fi, and even more so, I think, with these series mentioned previously. These are fun stories that introduce readers to gay characters like Percy Jackson, or non-binary ones like Magnus Chase, and I think these are invaluable. Often, when I'm reading these lists of book suggestions, I get wistful. Like, what would it have been like, I wonder, if I had had these books growing up? If I had seen myself represented on the page, what would that have meant to me as a kid? Well, recently, while revisiting an old favorite, the book series that I often credit with starting my love affair with sci-fi, I realized I might already have. Part 1. This book series stole my brain. Rod Albright's Alien Adventures is a middle grade sci-fi series written by Bruce Coville. You might recognize that name. Bookworms, especially those closer to my age, will know him for his adventure series for kids. So things like My Teacher Was an Alien, Space Brats, I Was a 6th Grade Alien. Okay, sorry, I have to interrupt myself here because while I was looking for the photographs of the book version of I Was a 6th Grade Alien, instead I found the television adaptation that was released mostly in Canada, the UK, and Australia, and I found this amazing photo that has Daniel Clark and Ryan Cooley in it, and it blew my mind a little bit. And so I had to go check it out and look at the cast of this television show, and y'all, there are 5 actors from Degrassi in this show. It is Daniel Clark, Ryan Cooley, Deanna Casaluce, Lauren Collins. Lauren Collins is in 5 episodes, and then a couple of side characters who showed up in like some random ones. And that is just the wildest thing. Like, what kind of What kind of craziness is that? Now I feel like I have to watch this show. Anyway, okay. Amulet of Doom, Jeremy Thatcher Dragon Hatcher, a particular favorite of mine, and of course, Aliens Ate My Homework and its sequels. I mean, I'm talking about one book series here, but I could probably make a whole video for this author and all of his various book series. Bruce Coville has won numerous awards for excellence in children's lit and sci-fi, and remains one of my biggest reading and writing influences. When I was a kid, I read anything with his name on it. I was introduced to his work through the Magic Shop series and the aforementioned Jeremy Thatcher Dragon Hatcher, as fantasy and especially dragons were something of a preoccupation of mine. It was the sci-fi books, however, that would end up having the most impact. Rod Albright and his journeys with the crew of the good ship Firkle became my comfort books, and I probably read them about 20 times. Also known as Rod Albright's Alien Adventures, the series consists of 4 books: Aliens Ate My Homework, I Left My Sneakers in Dimension X, The Search for Snout, and Aliens Stole My Body. While the first book reads as much more of a standalone, I'm not sure it was meant to be a series at this point, the other 3 are deeply connected, ending on cliffhangers, each one running directly into the next. Now, as I've already alluded to, I'm talking about these books because of their queer content, both implicit and, depending on your read of certain characters, very explicit. However, I picked up on none of this when I was reading these books in the early 2000s as a little baby gay. At the time, I only loved the fun adventure sci-fi, much of which was riffing on established science fiction tropes that I had not yet been introduced to. As far as baby's first sci-fi goes, these books are excellent. Like little mini Star Treks, they challenge the assumptions of the reader. Rod is often forced to confront something about human society that he took for granted, like Rod insisting that humans try to protect kids, only for Madame Pong to ask, well, if that's the case, then why are they allowed to live in a society where people are shooting each other all the time? If kids are supposed to be safe, why aren't they safe? I thought of some of the things I had seen on the news and decided maybe our society wasn't as serious about protecting kids as it likes to pretend. Okay, Bruce, that's savage. The books also poke fun at typical sci-fi tropes, my favorite being a moment between Rod and the captain as they're trekking through a swamp in Rod's backyard. When the captain reminisces that the swamp reminds him of home, Rod asks him if he grew up on a swamp planet. Quote, "Do you come from a swamp planet?" the captain replied. I started to ask what he meant, but then I figured it out on my own. A planet is a big place, and it's pretty silly to think that it will be the same from one pole to the other. Literally every time I watch Star Wars, I think of this scene. The books themselves are very simple. Here I'm going to give a brief synopsis of the series as a whole with some mild spoilers for some of the books. If spoilers for a children's series from about 3 decades ago is something that you're concerned about, then I really will recommend reading them now. They're really short, you're going to get through them real quick, a good time, and while Bruce Coville books aren't quite as ubiquitous on kids' shelves as they once were, these are still in print as well as available in ebook. Part 2. Aliens Ate My Homework. As the title of the book suggests, this is a somewhat goofy story about a 12-year-old named Rod Albright who becomes the unwilling host to a group of aliens that crash land into his room. These members of the Galactic Patrol, a sort of Starfleet analog if you're a Trek fan, crash their tiny ship Firkle into a vat of paper mache Rod was using to make a volcano for the science fair. And when I say tiny, by the way, I mean tiny aliens. These guys and their ship are probably about the size of your basic Kenner Star Wars toy. It turns out that they use a device to grow and shrink the ship for ease of travel, though the goopy paper mache has gummed up the works, and now they have to stay at Rod's for a while they repair it and hunt for an intergalactic space criminal that goes by the name of BKR. While the plot is simple, the characters and ideas are really interesting, and the book sometimes goes in unexpected directions. For example, one of the main conflicts in the first book is the main character's inability to lie. This is a huge liability when he is attempting to hide a bunch of tiny aliens in his room, and is also how the book gets its name. Unable to lie when a teacher demands his homework, Rod is forced to admit that it was, literally, eaten by the aliens. For most of the book, his chronic truthfulness is chalked up to an incident that occurred when he was a toddler, in which he attempted to lie with his hand caught pretty much literally in the cookie jar. However, in the scene in which Rod finally lies for the very first time, when the fate of the galaxy is on the line, another explanation is offered. "Come on, Rod," BKR says, "I know you never lie. I tried to swallow, but I couldn't. My hands trembled. I thought of Phil. I thought of Gracker and the others. I thought of my mother, weeping in the night because my father had lied to her." It's subtle, but this unspoken explanation for Rod's inability to lie, he doesn't want to be like his dad who abandoned and hurt his family, gives the character so much more depth than he had before. I'm not sure I picked up on it as a kid, but it was a nice detail to read as an adult. Aside from that, though, I've just never seen a book where learning to lie was seen as an asset, especially not in something aimed at kids. This is Rod's big character moment. When he gets a chance to show how the adventure has changed him, he does so by lying when the situation calls for it. Amazing. The first book's plot mainly consists of Rod and the aliens going on little adventures, as Rod has been deputized as an emergency member of the Galactic Patrol. This mainly consists of little things like Rod taking them out to a field so they can resize their ship to full size, Rod bringing the aliens to school and one of them being stolen by a bully, and the gang avoiding getting thrown into a storage dimension where they would have access to anything you could think of except oxygen. The story concludes with the revelation that BKR has been hiding out on Earth as Rod's personal bully, Billy Becker. As it turns out, the aliens are actually pretty short, even when they are sized up to their full size, and hiding out as a kid is the most effective method for staying hidden. Rod overcomes a number of obstacles as he helps the Galactic Patrol bring BKR to justice, and in the end, is rewarded with the respect and friendship of the crew of the Furkle. Speaking of... Part 3, Meet the Crew. In between the little action-packed moments of adventure, the books sprinkle in some really great character work. While the story and set pieces are fun, it's the characters where these books really shine. It's my favorite part, and it's the reason that the books have stuck with me for so long. So I'm going to go through them real quick. The first is Gracker, the ornery, duty-focused captain of the ship. He uses computer chip implants to modulate his emotional state, though whether this is a trait of his race or something all Galactic Patrol captains have to have installed is never really clarified, at least to my knowledge. Although, given some hints to how the Galactic Patrol functions, it very well could be the latter. These modules are one of my favorite running gags in the series. Throughout the books, Gracker is seen using, among others, a diplomatic module, a docility module, a berserk module, a judicial module, an open mind module, and my favorite is asked once after making a particularly controversial decision if he is using the demented ding-dong module. Gracker is tough, but he's a softie underneath it all. He is often seen getting sentimental at some of the more emotional points of the books. Madame Pong is the ship's diplomatic officer. She can be a cold bitch sometimes, which makes me love her even more. There's a ruthlessness to her that just makes her unpredictable. I think given that she's the ship's diplomat and the only woman on the crew, the reader expects her to be softer maybe and more empathetic, and she is, but she's also very sharp, able to make quick and brutal judgments about a situation and act on them. There are times when the humans are shocked at just how utilitarian she's being as the diplomat. Then we have Phil the Plant, the wisecracking engineer of the ship, Tar Gibbons, the ship's warrior scientist, whatever that means, and Snout, which is the crew's nickname for the long-nosed master of the mental arts, Flinge Iblick. There are, of course, a few more characters that do show up in the books. The main character is Rod. He's a 12-year-old. He's a little chubby and just trying to get by. I love Rod. Then we have Elspeth, Rod's bratty younger cousin, who tags along in the second book and gets dragged along for all of the subsequent action. And Rod picks up a little alien pet in Dimension X that ends up being important further down the line. There is also a rotating cast of alien characters in each book, providing flavor and intrigue into the world. Many of these are just given tantalizing vague backstories, such as the mysterious Salima Khan, who is on some sort of personal journey that is only hinted at but never really explained. And of course, there is the big bad, BKR. And just for clarity, I'm going to say right now that BKR doesn't stand for anything. His name is just 3 letters. I love it. Unfortunately, BKR is probably one of the weakest elements of the series. There are a lot of things I like about him and a few things that I don't. For one, he's just a bit evil for its own sake. He just seems to enjoy making people suffer and has made that his life's mission. Obviously, that's not super deep as far as villainous motivations go, though I do like how it ties in with the story of the first book. See, late in Aliens Ate My Homework, Rod, and by extension the audience, is finally told of BKR's crime, cruelty. Quote, "In the civilized galaxy, cruelty is the greatest of all crimes," said Madame Pong. Of course, life always involves some suffering, and there are times when painful things must be done for life to continue. But an intelligent being who takes pleasure in causing pain to others? Well, such a being is considered dangerously bent. "You must understand," said Tar Gibbons, "that empathy is the heart of civilization." Empathy? "The ability to understand what another feels," says Snout. "It is the trait that lifts us above the animals." "Speak for yourself," said Phil. I love it. You know what I mean, said Snout smoothly. An intelligent being who lacks empathy is a threat to the social order. Not caring what pain it causes, it may do damage beyond estimation. Causing needless suffering is a sickness, and those who do so are forever outside our law. I had a sudden sinking feeling that I knew why Earth had not yet been invited to join the League of Worlds. I really do like this idea that cruelty is the worst crime in the civilized galaxy. I mean, it's a little bit simplistic, obviously. It's a kid's book, but at the same time, I think it's really interesting. And it ties into the main themes of the book. After all, Rod has been the victim of brutal bullying for a very long time. And I don't know, I just think there's something very satisfying about being a 12-year-old who discovers that your bully is considered the greatest criminal in the known galaxy. Being bullied is a very powerless, hopeless feeling, and a bunch of aliens coming in to say, actually, bullying is one of the worst crimes that a living being can commit, and we're going to take your bully to space jail. I think that would probably feel extremely vindicating. And so at the very least, there is a justification for BKR being a character who likes to inflict needless pain, because he's supposed to embody the very essence of the worst crime, cruelty. So there is an explanation for his shallowness, and honestly, aside from that, I really enjoy him.
Here comes the murderer. He's got chipped teeth, tattoos, and dirty fingernails, and I'm thinking to myself, oh, he's kind of cute. He's a murderer! It's kind of cute.
He's a sassy little guy. He's always making quips at the crew and hinting at a background between him and Gracker. There's this one scene later in the books where he tells Madame Pong, like, hey, you should come with me when you get tired of Gracker. Like, what? It's crazy. And honestly, I think that the vagueness of his crimes only makes him more menacing. When asked about exactly what he did, the most Rod or Elspeth can get out of the crew is that millions have wept. This is the phrase that is most associated with BKR, and it gave me chills when I was a kid. Luckily, BKR is captured at the end of the first book. Unluckily, he escapes pretty much immediately, prompting the events of the rest of the series. Part 4, Alien Adventures. The first book was something of an introduction, and the rest of the books are more serialized. I Left My Sneakers in Dimension X starts with Rod and his cousin being kidnapped by BKR's best buddy, Smorkus Flinders. This giant monster lives in the dimension right next door to ours. We live in Dimension Q, and they live in Dimension X. And Rod and the crew sent to rescue him have to navigate their way through a strange world full of shape-shifting aliens, edible macaroni sky, and mind-building reality quakes that literally warp the world around them. After escaping back to our dimension, they go on the hunt for their friend Snout, who has gone missing, and BKR, who has gotten loose. One thing that I should note is that these later books are somewhat inspired by the second, third, and fourth Star Trek films, which some of you may have guessed just based on the name of the third book, The Search for Snout. There are a couple of examples of this. Smorkus Flinders and Gracker have a prior history that feeds into their rivalry. What exactly happened between the two of them is never explained, which is kind of common with these books actually. They'll just drop little tidbits and then you'll have to wonder about them for the rest of time. But anyway, it reminds me a bit of Khan and Kirk. In the third book, the crew chooses to disobey an order by the Galactic Patrol in order to try and find their friend Snout, and chooses to go renegade, which mirrors a similar set of events in the third Star Trek film. Snout, as well, is like Spock in more than just the title of his book, mirroring a title of a Star Trek story. A master of the mental arts, Snout has the ability to mind meld with crewmates, communicate telepathically, and remain in control of his emotional state, though in later books he does struggle with this after an accident nearly kills him. The Snout Spock and Gracker Kirk comparisons don't end there though. Ever since the beginning, the two have a relationship of mutual respect, much like something that you might see on Trek. Snout appears to be the only one who can get away with teasing the captain, and Gracker seems to hold Snout in the highest regard, relying on him just as much as Kirk relied on Spock, which I guess at this point brings us to Part 5, Queering Space. Sci-fi has a long history of telling queer stories, even if only in metaphor. For example, Star Trek, which I've already compared these books to many times, has flirted with queerness since The Next Generation, both implicitly with the Janai and more explicitly with Jadzia Dax and its first gay on-screen kiss in Deep Space Nine. Jadzia is a member of a race known as the Trill, humanoid aliens who may take on a symbiont. These symbionts are genderless, long-living creatures that join with a willing Trill host, often many Trill over the course of their lifespan. In the joining, they share their memories, feelings, and experiences of all of their past lives with their new host. Jadzia is the new host of Dax, a long-living symbiont who was last joined with a male Trill named Curzon. Throughout the course of Deep Space Nine, she encounters a number of old friends from Dax's past. LGBTQ+ fans of the show are fond of these scenes as pitch-perfect examples of how to react when an old friend tells you their new name and pronoun.
Oh, Curzon, my beloved old friend.
I'm Jadzia now.
Well, Jadzia, my beloved old friend.
Based core, as the kids might say. It is through this lens that I read the queerness of the Rod Albright books. The first book in the series was published the same year as the release of Deep Space Nine Season 1, just to give you a little bit of context. The first gay kiss on Star Trek had not yet even happened. So while some of what I'm reading here is subtextual, I still find it compelling for its time and, more importantly, for its medium, which is, of course, a middle grade book. The two main points of queerness in this series are the gender of aliens and the relationship between Snout and Gracker. Let's address the latter first, because this is my theory that is the most likely to be interpreted as a bit of fan fiction on my part, though I do wholeheartedly believe that Snout and Gracker either are or were in love in some point in the series. At least it is hinted at, though never explicitly stated outright. So first, there's the obvious. As I've already laid out, Gracker and Snout are pretty obvious Kirk and Spock analogs, and while Kirk and Spock do not have a canon romantic relationship, to say that they are associated with one another would be an understatement. As I'm sure you know, the original Trek fans built the foundation for what would become modern fandom, creating fanzines to speculate on plot threads and technology, sharing fan art and fan fiction, and even, of course, eventually creating the hugely popular Kirk and Spock ship. These Kirk and Spock fans, they weren't called shippers because that term wouldn't be coined until the X-Files in the 90s, used a slash to denote their belief in the premise, the idea that Kirk and Spock were romantically or sexually involved. K/S, the Kirk/Spock. This slash would eventually become a genre of fiction in its own right, where early on it was used primarily to refer to queer pairings. This context may prove important as we go through the relationship between Snout and Gracker, which is both tender and familiar. For example, in this scene in the first book, when Rod accidentally breaks a mind connection with Snout, which causes him great pain. Snout screamed and fell to the floor. "What happened?" I cried. "What is it?" "He told you not to move," snapped Gracker, kneeling beside the fallen alien. With a gentleness that surprised me, he lifted Snout's head into his fallen lap. Or, in another scene when they must say goodbye to each other before a dangerous mission. "Farewell, my captain," he whispered, embracing Gracker. To my surprise, Gracker hugged him back. "Farewell, faithful friend," he growled. "Be well until we meet again. That's an order." During the middle two books of the series, Snout is pulled away by a mysterious force, and the crew is sent to look for him. Gracker's behavior during these books is very telling. He throws himself on Snout's body as his friend begins to fade out from our plane of existence. He expresses jealousy that Snout telepathically contacted Rod instead of himself. And Madame Pong calls Gracker's wish to find Snout his greatest desire. For context, this is greater even than his desire to recapture BKR. Even their reunion implies a deep emotional connection as Gracker asks, "Where were you?" to Snout, quote, "I could hear a note of hurt in his voice." Snout also shows a deep affection for the captain. When expressing why he wishes to continue living on this plane, he says, "Life is good. I like it here. I have good friends, beings I care about deeply." He looked around at the crew, acknowledging each of us, though I noticed that his gaze lingered especially on the captain and on Salima Khan. Later, when overcome with sorrow while being attacked by some psychic trees, don't ask, Snout wails out two names in his mourning, Salima Khan and Gracker. However, perhaps the most compelling bit of evidence comes in the first book, where it is casually dropped that every alien has their own room on the ship, except for Snout and the captain, who share a room.
And they were roommates.
Oh my god, they were roommates.
Now, wait a second, you might be saying, Kat, if Snout and Gracker are in a committed romantic relationship, then who exactly is this Salima Khan character, and why is Snout so interested in her? This is a great question, and I want to address it, but I'm gonna need you to stick a pin in it for a minute, because first, I want to loop back to Tar Gibbons and talk about alien genders. So when I talk about this book having a couple more explicitly queer moments, Tar Gibbons is the number one example for me. It is impossible to deny that Tar Gibbons is a character character that does not conform to the gender binary as we understand it on Earth. This is a thing that comes up a couple of times, and while rereading it, I was honestly really shocked at how much I enjoyed the way that it was handled. Sci-fi is, of course, a place a lot of us old nerds were first introduced to the concept of a non-binary sex or gender. From Ursula K. Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness to the aforementioned Janai in Star Trek, for whom identifying along the binary as either male or female was seen as a taboo. Tar Gibbons is no different. Other than Phil the plant, who is literally a speaking sentient sunflower, the tar is the least humanoid of the crew. It has 4 legs, 2 arms, and a long neck it is fond of stretching toward the people it is speaking to. Early on, we learn that the tar part of Tar Gibbons is not its first name, but an honorific, a non-gendered title that means roughly wise and beloved warrior who can kill me with a little finger should he so desire. It is only later, however, that we are given the full rundown about the tar's biology and pronouns. This is a little long, but I'm going to read most of that scene here because I find it fascinating and I want to talk about it. Tar Gibbons said, "I have no problems with brothers or sisters because I have none." "Do you like being an only child?" I asked. "Oh, I wasn't an only child. I had several siblings, just no brothers or sisters." "Wait a minute. Siblings are people who have the same parents as you do, so you had to have brothers or sisters." "Brothers are male, correct?" I nodded. "And sisters are female?" When I nodded again, Tar Gibbons spread his arms, leaned that long neck forward, blinked at me, and said, "Then I don't have any." "Well, that just doesn't make sense." I was starting to get a little angry because I thought he was teasing me. "Why not? They have to be one or the other." "Oh, don't be silly. I am neither male nor female. I'm a farfel." "Is that more like a boy or a girl?" "Actually, it's more like a pippic than anything." I turned to Madame Pong, but she just spread her hands. "I don't think you want to get into a discussion of biology as it is practiced on Tar Gibbons' planet." "Okay," I said. "Just tell me what pronoun to use when I'm talking about him." Her. It. I mean, see what I mean?" "It will do just fine," said Tar Gibbons. "What will do just fine?" "It will," he repeated. This Abbott and Costello routine goes on for a little bit. And then, "That seems pretty rude," I said nervously. "Not as rude as calling me a he or she," it said. I sighed and turned back to my volcano. I had to think about this for a while. We never do get to see Rod actually process this information. However, if you were paying attention, you may have noticed something important. Within the scene itself, Rod changes which pronouns he uses to refer to the tar. For the entirety of the book up to this point, Rod has been referring to the tar using he, him pronouns. Then, when Rod becomes unsure of what to use, he doesn't use any. He only refers to the tar as Tar Gibbons at that point. However, once Rod realizes that the tar is requesting the use of it, its pronouns, Rod immediately shifts in the narrative. "Not as rude as calling me a he or she," it said. And as uncomfortable as it is, I think, for Rod to see this creature that is a living thing worthy of respect and refer to it using it, its pronouns, he does it from that point without question. This is reinforced within every single book. During the introduction of the aliens, the book makes a point of introducing the tar in this way so that the audience knows. In one book, Elspeth says, "It's not a mister, it's a tar." In another, Rod simply explains that using he or she pronouns is offensive to it. I find the use of it, its pronouns a little complicated. Obviously, nowadays, I would prefer to see something like they, them pronouns. I think they're a little bit less dehumanizing. It can be nerve-wracking because, of course, for a lot of people who are gender nonconforming, it is a pronoun that is often used to hurt and insult people. So I'm often wary about its use in media. However, I kind of think that Rod's discomfort with the idea of referring to the tar with it, its pronouns in the first place kind of subverts this. And I also think I can forgive it for coming out in the 90s, before the singular they, them was something that was being talked about a lot. Not to mention, the tar is not the only alien that does not conform to a binary understanding of sex or gender. Though we never see these other aliens, they are mentioned. For example, in a later scene, Elspeth appeals to Madame Pong as a woman, saying that they need to stick together. When Madame Pong claims that the civilized galaxy does not discriminate based on sex or gender, Elspeth protests that the Ferkel only has one female crew member, implying that this is evidence of sexism. Madame Pong replies that one ship isn't a particularly good sample size, and that there may be ships with single gender crews, or men and women in equal number, or, quote, crews with at least 16 genders represented. Rod eventually becomes so acclimated to this idea that he begins questioning his own notions of gender even without prompting. At one point, for example, he is speaking to a brain in a jar. Again, don't ask. And he calls it sir without thinking. Immediately, he regrets it, second-guessing his own assumptions about gender. This non-binary understanding of sex and gender was probably my favorite thing about the books when I was a kid. For some reason, I always really loved it when books did things like this, like in the Enchanted Forest series by Patricia C. Reedy, how the titles of King and Queen of the Dragons are jobs with specific duties, not titles given based on the gender of the dragon who holds the position. The female King of the Dragons and the neither male nor female Tar Gibbons lodged themselves into my brain and stuck there, curious and fascinating possibilities. Part 7. I left my queer canon in another book series. Now, you might say, okay, Kat, Tar Gibbons uses it/its pronouns, but that's not the same as non-binary representation. After all, as mentioned in the book, the tar species has a different biology than humans. So that doesn't justify non-binary people. As for the Snout and Cracker stuff, I think you're just reading way too deep into a book series for kids written mostly in the 90s.
Why are you gay?
Who says I'm gay?
You are gay.
There's no way that Bruce Coville intended his characters to be read this way. I mean, look at the Salima Khan character. She's a woman, and Snout obviously likes her at least as much as he likes Cracker. So without him saying so in the books, how can we say that Coville intended him to be queer? This is true, and it's a fair criticism. We don't. But given that Bruce Coville himself is openly bisexual, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that he might have considered it. His explicit inclusion of Salima Khan as a possible love interest, if indeed that is what's going on with her, it's again very vague, could have been a conscious attempt for him creating a bisexual character. But it's true, there is nothing explicit in this book. Bruce Coville would eventually go on to write more explicitly queer characters. After writing many of the books in this series, for example, in one of his Magic Shop books, The Skull of Truth, the main character's uncle comes out as gay. Even though it was published in 1997, this book was banned in a number of places, in part just for having a gay character. Also, just a side note, I think for like occult and satanic imagery, a lot of Bruce Coville's novels were banned for having like occult imagery that wasn't really occult imagery. It was just like cool fantasy stuff. Woof. I want to say I'm glad we're past that, except it looks like we're not right now, so. Not to mention, The Skull of Truth was not his only story that was banned for having queer characters in it. Another one of his works, a short story called Am I Blue, was banned for its tale of a young man confused about his own sexuality, as well as its use of slurs. In Am I Blue, the main character is given the ability to see the queerness of the people around him as the color blue. Some people will turn a deep shade of navy, while others just have a light tinge, representing a broad spectrum of sexualities and experiences. Coville has even written about his own bisexuality in the nonfiction collection The Letter Q, Queer Writers' Notes to Their Younger Selves. In a deeply moving letter, he talks about the difficulty of growing up without the language to express who he was, though in his search, he came up with the word ambisextrous, which I am obsessed with, and how even once he discovered bisexuality, he was still an outsider. He writes about the pain of having to defend your sexuality as real, legitimate, not a phase or a step on the road to really coming out, but its own joyful, wonderful way of being. Anyway, he writes towards the end of the letter, what you really are is queer. Not queer in the sense of a guy who only likes guys, but queer in the sense of being really, really different. You're going to find that even when you're in a subgroup, you don't quite fit in. This is something that a lot of bisexuals have experienced, myself included. This letter could have been written to a younger me. And it's hard for me not to look at these books and these characters as something that was written by a man who had all of these experiences. And so all this to say, could I be reading into Snout? His feelings for Cracker, their shared bedroom, this implied intimacy? Sure, but I choose to give younger me the gift of bisexual Snout, just like I choose to give her the gift of a non-binary Tar Gibbons. Regardless of whether it was an alien or not, I was given a blueprint of how to ask for someone's pronouns and use them, even if I didn't understand. To see something so foreign, so quickly accepted by Rod, who even goes on to say in later books that he loves the tar, was not nothing. This part's unscripted, but I just had this thought. I am one of the people who jumped on the incredible Our Flag Means Death bandwagon when it came out earlier this year. That show means so much to me as someone who was often told how delusional I was for reading queer characters out of subtext. It was so validating to see this love story come to life and to be told, no, this story that you're seeing that is so powerful is also true and real.
Oh my God, this is happening.
And so, of course, I understand the impact of explicit canon representation. But among the fandom, there's been a lot of discussion about stories like Good Omens, which has a lot of subtext about the characters Aziraphale and Crowley. These are two characters who clearly love each other, but because their love is never explicitly stated to be romantic on screen, there will always be people who deny it. And I seem to be watching two camps form about this topic. There are the people who say that we should make it explicit so that people can have this and hold on to it, because it is so powerful to have that explicit representation. And I absolutely understand that perspective. But then I also get the perspective of other people who say that this relationship that they see on the screen or on the page is just as valid even if it is never explicitly spelled out, especially considering that we let straight couples get away with this shit all the time. The quote that I keep seeing pop up is, when a heterosexual man or woman sit next to each other, we immediately assume that they're in love, but we can't give the benefit of the doubt to these two characters in Good Omens who clearly would give their lives for each other. And I understand that argument too. I find myself split when thinking about these books, although obviously I would rather have them than not. Am I recommending these books now? Actually, yeah, I am. If you know any kids of the age range of like 8 to 13 who like sci-fi or fantasy, I wholeheartedly recommend them. They have some really great stuff in them that I didn't really talk about. There's a super cool life form with 2 separate bodies that has to work together to sustain itself. A giant beast gnawing at the roots of a huge tree in what seems to be a reference to the Norse myth of Nidhogg and the World Tree. There's this great scene where the Tar explains to Rod that most of the work that humans do on Earth isn't real, and that real work gives joy while false work breeds despair. That was amazing. I had to put the book down for a minute after reading that. Some real good sci-fi shit. But as I mentioned earlier, I also really love and appreciate the stories of explicit queerness in children's lit. While I was overjoyed to discover that these books that meant the world to me as a kid were also so queer without me truly knowing it, maybe I knew it on some level, I am glad for the stories kids are being given now. A non-binary alien is great, but a non-binary human is better. Same too, of course, goes for textually written characters, and especially bisexual ones who still tend to raise some controversy with their appearances even now. Which is to say, if you have any recommendations for YA or middle grade books that include LGBTQ+ characters, please leave them in the comments. There's still a little bit of time left to celebrate Pride by supporting these groups, especially those with queer authors. Though, if you are watching this after June, remember that you can and should support queer stories all year round. I want to give another shout out to Bruce Coville, who I cannot overstate, wrote so many of the things that fueled my passion for sci-fi and fantasy to this day. Guaranteed I would not have moved on to the things like Neil Stephenson and stuff that became later my very favorite books of all time without him. I would also like to thank my patrons, everyone you see on screen here, but especially Amanda Johnson, Cassandra Barker, Isabella Petroni, Mary Danielson, Smith NC, Anne Verlang and Lottie Comics, and all of my viewers, including my patrons who have been so patient with me. We do have more stuff coming up. Degrassi is coming up next, since I know folks are going to ask. We are working our way through that one. It is a big one. Luckily, I think later seasons are going to be a bit easier, but season 4 is a tough one. Happy Pride, y'all. I hope that it's a good one. And until next time, I hope you have a great day.